Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch this brief video providing an overview of the Education chapter for the 2026 update to the Massachusetts Rural Policy Plan. In this video, we will review the context regarding rural education challenges, recent progress made, and the draft recommendations in the plan. Your watching this video now will allow us to have meaningful discussion during our public engagement meetings for the Education chapter. When we convene our virtual statewide feedback meetings, the primary questions we will have for attendees are: does the summary of this chapter's challenges, successes, and achievements feel right and representative of your community? Which of the recommendations would make the biggest difference in your community? And what is missing? The goal of the Education chapter of the Rural Policy Plan is to ensure all rural Massachusetts students receive high-quality education by stabilizing school finances and sustaining strong, community-centered schools despite declining enrollment and rising costs. Rural Massachusetts faces an educational crisis rooted in the mismatch between fixed costs and declining revenues. In rural districts, per-pupil costs are significantly higher, primarily because it is difficult for small districts to create economies of scale. Many small districts have experienced a dramatic decrease in enrollment due to demographic changes, combined with competition from private schools, homeschooling, cross-district school choice, charter schools, and career vocational technical high schools. Declining enrollments do not lead to proportional decreases in expenses. Fixed costs for transportation, employee benefits, special education, higher per-pupil costs for charter and vocational students that are the responsibility of the sending district, facility maintenance, administration, and legacy costs such as retiree health insurance from an era of higher enrollments remain or increase even when student populations shrink. The current Chapter 70 school funding formula does not adequately account for the higher per-pupil cost of rural schools, and factors in the formula like income and equalized value can have a disproportionate impact on rural municipalities, and that is, a community with a small number of households has a lower denominator that cannot counter or absorb outliers. Despite a legislative promise of full funding for regional school transportation that encouraged many towns to regionalize districts decades ago, this promise has never been realized. Lack of competition for school transportation vendors results in double-digit increases with each contract renewal. Increased fuel costs and large geographic areas that require multiple buses come at the cost of teaching and learning. School choice and charter schools vie for limited students, and the charter school funding formula often results in districts paying out a higher per-student cost than they can invest in their own students. The special education circuit breaker formula does not recognize the cost of transporting students long distances for services, which is typical in rural areas, and the timing of reimbursement from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is unpredictable and is certainly not in the year the expense is borne. These factors result in disparities in educational opportunities and create intense competition for limited local financial resources between schools and town governments. While rural school aid began in fiscal year 19, the need for increased state aid for rural and small school districts was well documented in the 2022 A Sustainable Future for Rural Schools that identified the need for $60 million in rural school aid. Because rural school aid is subject to annual appropriation, it cannot provide the stable, predictable support rural districts need. While the rural school aid line item grew from $1.5 million in FY19 to $16 million in FY25, the appropriation was cut by 25% to $12 million for FY26, harming districts that rely on these funds for essential expenses such as educator salaries and special education. Most of Massachusetts' 65 districts receiving school aid have seen zero additional dollars from the Student Opportunity Act since 2019. A Sustainable Future for Rural Schools did not identify reopening the Chapter 70 formula as its primary recommendation because, as with many rural equity issues, it quickly became clear that changing the Chapter 70 formula to improve rural equity could reduce funding to districts in more populous parts of the state and would not be politically supported. While rural districts do collaborate on some programs and services, deeper regionalization is often prohibitively expensive, politically difficult, and will not solve the financial crisis. Small elementary schools often serve as community hubs that residents are unwilling to lose, and long bus rides for young children create additional barriers to consolidation. Rural communities in Massachusetts need policy solutions that recognize rural context, rather than assuming that further regionalization alone can resolve these challenges. Advocates describe a vicious cycle. After non-essential programs are cut, families with options move their children elsewhere, leading to further enrollment loss, lower aid, and deeper cuts, until only the poorest students remain, with access to a hollowed-out education. In March of 2026, advocacy became coordinated, highlighting the increasing desperation rural communities experience regarding education financing. The Rural and Declining Enrollment School Week of Action resulted in educators, students, and families from rural school districts across the state highlighting their concerns to send a message to the State House in Boston. These pictures are from a rally at Frontier Regional High School, where students spelled out SOS, or Save Our Schools. Local property taxpayers cannot afford to continue paying ever-increasing costs that outpace inflation and outpace the limits of Proposition 2.5. There are more municipal property tax levy override attempts than ever before, and many of those override votes are failing. Absent meaningful and timely implementation of the following recommendations and the active, participatory, and meaningful engagement of the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to make significant policy and financing changes, many rural school districts will fail. The following recommendations are high level. Many of the recommendations in each chapter of the plan include sub-recommendations that speak to specific strategies and tactics regarding how the high-level recommendation could be implemented. We strongly encourage you to review the PDF of the full recommendations for this chapter at the same URL through which you accessed this video. The URL is also cited at the top of these slides. The recommendations are: 1. Increase rural school aid to $60 million, with annual increases tied to inflation. 2. Reform the Chapter 70 formula and the local contribution formula to recognize the increased per-pupil costs in rural districts and the unique rural financial impacts of factors in the formula. 3. Adopt a sustainable future for rural schools and aligned policy changes to stabilize rural district finances. And lastly, 4. Support comprehensive collaboration between rural schools through dedicated funding and facilitated shared services. Again, when we convene our virtual statewide feedback meetings, the primary questions we will have for attendees are: does the summary of this chapter's challenges, successes, and achievements feel right and representative of your community? Which of these recommendations would make the biggest difference in your community? And what is missing? Thank you again for taking the time to review this chapter, and we look forward to speaking with you live soon. In the interim, if you have questions or concerns, please direct them to Mark Maloney, Communications Manager with the Franklin Regional Council of Governments. Thanks again. Take care.